The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Eudora Brenner decided she had nothing left to lose. She stood on the platform of the St. Louis railway station with a single carpet bag at her feet, a second-hand brown coat that was slightly too large for her narrow shoulders, and a one-way ticket to Cimarron, New Mexico territory, pressed between her fingers like a small, rectangular verdict. Around her, the city hummed with its familiar noise, vendors calling out prices, horses clopping on cobblestones, the distant shriek of a factory whistle, but Eudora felt removed from all of it, as though she were watching the scene through wavy glass. She was 24 years old. She had been a seamstress, a boarder, a dutiful niece, and most recently an embarrassment. And now she was being sent west. Her Aunt Clara had made the arrangements with the efficiency of a woman dispatching an unwanted piece of furniture. Clara Brenner, whose husband owned half a street of dry goods stores and whose reputation in certain St. Louis parlors was everything to her, had handed Eudora the ticket with a tight smile and told her it was an opportunity. The word had sounded hollow then. It sounded hollower now, standing in the August heat of 1884 with sweat gathering at the back of her neck, and the certain knowledge that no one in St. Louis would miss her. The incident that had made Eudora inconvenient, because that was what it amounted to, inconvenience, was not entirely her fault. She had said so plainly to her aunt, and her aunt had agreed with a barely perceptible nod before continuing to fold the train ticket into Eudora's hand. She had refused the attentions of a Mr. Gerald Hollis, a business acquaintance of her uncle's, and she had refused them loudly and in the presence of witnesses at a dinner party. Gerald Hollis had gone red in the face and knocked over a gravy boat, and somehow, because the world was arranged the way it was in 1884, it was Eudora who had become the problem. She was, Clara had explained, to go to the New Mexico territory and act as a housekeeper for a cattle rancher by the name of Wesley Thatcher. He was apparently a decent man, a friend of someone her uncle knew tangentially through a cattle broker, who had written to inquire about respectable domestic help. The arrangement was not charity, Clara had been careful to say. Eudora would be paid a small wage. She would have her own room. She would be useful in a place where her sharp tongue and her unwillingness to be agreeable would perhaps matter less, because the territory was full of rough characters and she would fit right in. That last part, Eudora was fairly sure, had been meant as an insult. She picked up her carpet bag and stepped onto the train. The journey from St. Louis to the New Mexico territory in the summer of 1884 was not a gentle one. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had by then pushed its lines deep into the Southwest, and Eudora spent 3 days and 2 nights rattling through Missouri, Kansas, and the broad, sun-hammered plains of the territory, watching the landscape transform from green river-bottom country into something stranger and more severe. The trees disappeared first. Then the gentle hills flattened into tableland that seemed to go on until the edge of everything. The sky expanded in a way that felt almost aggressive, as though it were pressing down on the land to remind it who was in charge. She ate what little she had packed: hard bread, a wedge of cheese, 2 apples that bruised before she could finish them, and slept in short, uncomfortable intervals against the window glass. In the car with her rode a traveling salesman who smelled of bay rum, a Mexican family with 3 quiet children, and an older woman in black traveling to visit a son she clearly feared she would never see again. None of them spoke much. The territory had a way of making people go still. She arrived in Cimarron on a Thursday afternoon, and the town received her the way a man receives a stranger, with watchful eyes and no warmth to speak of. Cimarron in 1884 was a real town, with a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a livery, and a sheriff's office that had seen more action than its weathered facade suggested. The Colfax County War had been a recent and bitter thing in this part of the territory, and the memory of it clung to the place like smoke. People here were cautious. People here knew that deals could go wrong, and that powerful men did not always follow the rules, and that the land itself had opinions. Eudora stood in the street outside the railway station, a modest building that served also as the post office, and looked around at the flat-roofed adobe buildings and the wide, dusty street and the mountains rising to the west in colors she had no names for, all rust and violet and a kind of gold that was not quite gold. She was tired, and she was thirsty, and she did not know where she was going. Eudora Brenner, she turned. The man standing behind her was not what she had expected, though she realized she had not known what to expect. He was tall, notably so, with the kind of lean, work-built frame that came from years of physical labor rather than any gift of nature. He wore a battered brown hat that had been rained on enough times to lose its shape, a faded blue shirt, and canvas trousers tucked into well-worn boots. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two older, with a face that was weathered by sun and wind to a shade that made his gray eyes startling by contrast. He was not holding his hat in his hand the way a man presenting himself would. He was just standing there, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts cautious and curious. "I am," she said, "and you would be Mr. Thatcher, I suppose." "Wesley," he said. "Nobody calls me Mr. Thatcher. It was my father's name, and he's been dead 6 years." It was such a plainly stated, unexpectedly personal thing to say to a complete stranger that Eudora did not know what to do with it for a moment. She recovered. "Wesley, then," she said. "I hope you were told I was coming because I've been on a train for 3 days, and if there's been a miscommunication, I'm going to need a moment before I can deal with it sensibly." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "I was told," he said. He picked up her carpet bag before she could object, which she would have, and nodded toward the far end of the street where a wagon and 2 horses stood tethered outside the general store. "Got a few supplies to load and then we ride out. Ranch is about 8 miles north. You all right on a wagon bench?" "I am," she said. "I grew up in Missouri, not a parlor." He looked at her briefly, a sidelong assessment, and then simply walked toward the wagon. Eudora followed. They did not speak much on the ride out of Cimarron, and Eudora was grateful for it. She was exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep, and the landscape around her demanded a kind of attention that left little room for conversation. The road, if it could be called a road, it was more of an intention pressed into the earth, wound north along a river that she would learn was the Cimarron, its banks lined with cottonwoods that flickered silver in the afternoon light. To the east the land rolled out in grass that had gone summer brown, scattered with juniper and the occasional outcropping of pale rock. To the west, the mountains rose in their improbable colors, and the sky above them was a blue that seemed to have no ceiling. Wesley drove the wagon with the ease of a man who had done it so many times that his hands knew the task without consulting his mind. Eudora sat beside him with her carpet bag on her lap. She had retrieved it from the wagon bed when he was loading flour sacks, and watched the land. It was nothing like Missouri. It was nothing like anywhere she had ever been. It was too large and too dry and too bluntly beautiful, and she was not sure yet whether she found it threatening or magnificent. She suspected it might be both. "How long have you been out here?" she asked, when the silence had settled enough that a question seemed natural rather than anxious. "Born here," he said. "My father came from Tennessee in '52 with a mule and bad information about silver mines. Ended up running cattle instead. I took the ranch on when he died. Your mother passed when I was 12. He said it without any particular weight, the way a man states a fact he has long since absorbed. Eudora thought about her own mother, dead of typhoid fever when Eudora was 7, and the years with her aunt after that, and felt the familiar muted press of that particular grief. "I'm sorry," she said. He glanced at her. "Long time ago," he said. "That doesn't really make it matter less." He was quiet for a beat. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They arrived at the Thatcher ranch as the sun was getting low and the shadows were going long and purple across the ground. The ranch was not what Eudora had imagined, which she admitted to herself had been some approximation of squalor. It was a working ranch. The corrals were well built, the barn was substantial, and there was a bunkhouse set some distance from the main house, and the main house itself was a low, solid adobe building with a covered porch along the front and a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat to weeds along the east side. It was not fancy. It was not the kind of house that appeared in the illustrated magazines her aunt had kept on the parlor table, but it was clearly made with care, and it had stood for some time, and it was real in a way that Eudora found, unexpectedly, reassuring. Two ranch hands came from the direction of the barn as the wagon pulled in. One was a young Mexican man named Felix, perhaps 19 or 20, with a ready smile and quick dark eyes. The other was older, a white-haired man named Hob who had a gimpy leg from an old horse injury and a disposition that was somewhere between gruff and kindly, depending on the hour. "Hob and Felix run the cattle operation with me," Wesley said, climbing down from the wagon. "There's about 400 head on the grazing range right now. You'd be handling the house, the cooking, the kitchen garden. Maybe help Hob with the horses if it doesn't suit you to be indoors all the time." "I don't particularly like being indoors all the time," Eudora said, and she caught Felix suppressing a smile. "Fair enough," said Wesley. He showed her into the house. The interior was plain and orderly, with the particular tidiness of a man who has learned to keep things in their place because there is no one else to put them back. The main room served as sitting room and dining room both, with a table that could seat four and a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. The kitchen was through a doorway to the left, a practical room with a good cast-iron stove, an oak work table, and shelves of provisions. Her room was off the back of the kitchen, small, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that faced east so that it caught the morning light. It was, she thought, looking at that window and the slice of darkening sky beyond it, the first room she had occupied in years that was entirely her own. "It's fine," she told Wesley, who was standing in the doorway looking slightly uncertain in the way that men look when they've done something they hope is adequate. "It's more than fine, thank you." He nodded once. "Supper's usually around 6. I'll cook tonight. You can find your feet in the morning." "You cook?" she asked, the question escaping before she could decide whether it was polite. "I have to eat," he said simply, and he left her to unpack. She was awake before dawn the next morning, which she supposed was not surprising given the state of her nerves and the strangeness of the place. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch horses in the corrals, the distant bawl of cattle, a wind that came off the mountains and pushed at the window frame, and she thought about her situation with the careful, analytical part of her mind that her aunt had always called her worst quality, and that Eudora privately considered her best one. She was here because she had been sent here. She was here because refusing a man's unwanted attention had made her somebody's problem, and the solution to that problem had been to put her on a train and ship her to the edge of the known world. She was aware of the injustice of it, and she allowed herself a few minutes in the gray pre-dawn to feel the full, sharp weight of that injustice, because she had found that pretending such things did not hurt, only made them worse. She had lost her position and her home and her city, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was a woman in 1884, and the preferences of a well-connected man outweighed her dignity in the ledger that society kept. And then she got up, because daylight was coming and there was a kitchen garden that needed attention and a stove that needed stoking, and she was not the kind of person who lay in bed nurturing grievances when there was work to be done. She was in the kitchen garden by 6 in the morning, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants and the bean rows, when Wesley came out of the back door of the house with 2 cups of coffee and stopped at the sight of her on her knees in the dirt. "You didn't have to start yet," he said. "I know," she said. She took the cup of coffee he offered and stood, brushing her hands on her apron. "But these beans have gone almost past saving, and it seemed like a shame." He looked at the garden, which in truth had suffered considerably from neglect, and then at her, and she had the impression he was recalibrating something. "My wife used to keep this garden," he said. Eudora had not known there was a wife, or had been one. She waited. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "Fever. After that I just—" He trailed off, and the gesture he made was not dismissive but honest, the gesture of a man who had found himself unable to do a thing that had belonged to someone else. The garden went. "I'm sorry," Eudora said. "What was her name?" "Margaret." He said it quietly. "She was from Santa Fe. Her family thought she was making a mistake marrying a cattle rancher." He paused. "She proved them wrong for 6 years." They stood in the morning light with their coffee, and Eudora thought that there was something very sad and very dignified about Wesley Thatcher, and that she had not expected either of those things when she climbed off the train in Cimarron. "I'll have these beans back in order within a week," she said finally. "And the tomatoes are still good. You'll have them before autumn." He nodded, looking at the garden rather than at her. "Thank you," he said. The first weeks at the Thatcher Ranch were a process of learning the routines, the rhythms, the particular requirements of a household that had been running in a reduced and bachelor-efficient way for 3 years. Eudora reorganized the kitchen shelves, which had accumulated a somewhat chaotic variety of tinned goods and dried provisions, and she established a cooking schedule that meant proper hot meals at regular hours, rather than the improvised arrangements that Wesley and Hob and Felix had apparently been managing. She revived the kitchen garden with a methodical determination that Felix observed with open admiration, telling her one afternoon that she had a gift with growing things, which she accepted as a compliment even though she suspected he was really just grateful for the fresh tomatoes. She also learned the land, in the way that you learn something by paying it sustained attention. She took to walking in the evenings, after supper was cleared and the kitchen was set to rights, following the river north through the cottonwoods, or climbing the low rise to the east where you could see the whole sweep of the valley, and the mountains going from rust to violet to shadow. She had not expected to love the land out here. She had not expected to feel anything about it except the mild alienation of a person in an unfamiliar place. But the territory had a way of getting under your skin, and she found herself starting to look for things, the particular quality of the evening light on the grass, the way the thunderheads built over the mountains in the afternoons and sometimes came no closer, the tracks of deer along the river bank, the cooler air that came with night and smelled of sage and something deeper, something mineral and ancient. Wesley began to join her on these evening walks, which was not something either of them planned or announced. It simply happened the way things happen in a place where the evenings are long, and the house is small. One evening he was sitting on the porch when she came out after supper, and he fell into step beside her without comment, and after that it was a thing they did. They walked along the river and talked, or did not talk, both being apparently comfortable with silence, which was itself a discovery. Eudora had spent years in houses where silence was treated as a failure of social obligation. They talked about everything and nothing, about the cattle market, which in 1884 was beginning to show the early signs of the oversupply that would devastate the industry in a few years, though they did not know that yet. They talked about the politics of the territory, which were tangled and sometimes violent, the legacy of the land-grant wars, and the ongoing struggles between large landowners and small settlers. Eudora had been reading the newspapers that came with the weekly supply run into Cimarron, and she had opinions, which Wesley received with the same thoughtful attention he seemed to give everything. He did not tell her that women shouldn't bother with politics, which had been Gerald Hollis's position on the matter, among others. She told him about St. Louis, about her aunt's house and the years of being useful in exchange for a home, about the seamstress work and the small savings she had managed, and the incident with Gerald Hollis that had resulted in her being here. She was matter-of-fact about it because she had decided she would not be ashamed of a thing she had no reason to be ashamed of, and he listened without interrupting. "That's a poor kind of justice," he said when she had finished. "It's the common kind," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know that doesn't make it right." "No," she said, "it doesn't. There was a pause, and then he said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "Someone more defeated," he said. "That's an honest answer and maybe not a kind one." "I'll take honest," she said. "I've had enough of kind that's actually just comfortable." He looked at her sideways in the fading light. "Yeah," he said, "I suppose you have." She was not defeated. But she was, in some part of herself that she did not examine too closely yet, more tender than she appeared. The years in her aunt's house had required a particular kind of armor, a sharpness of tongue, a quickness of wit, a posture of self-sufficiency, and she had worn it so long that she sometimes forgot it was armor. Being in this place, in this particular quietness, with this particular man who asked nothing of her except that she do the work she had come to do, she began sometimes to feel it loosening. This was alarming and also, in a way she could not yet name, something like relief. September came to the territory in colors that had no equivalent in Missouri. The cottonwoods along the river went gold in a single week, as if they had been waiting for a signal. The mornings grew sharp with cold while the afternoons remained warm, and the light changed into something cleaner and more precise, the sky going a blue that was almost artificial. Eudora filled the root cellar with the vegetables from the kitchen garden, her garden now. She had begun to think of it privately, and put up tomatoes and beans in glass jars that she lined up on the kitchen shelves with a satisfaction that surprised her. One afternoon in late September, a rider came to the ranch in a hurry. He was a young man from the neighboring spread, a modest operation about 5 miles southeast run by a couple named Alvarez Eduardo and his wife Consuelo. And he came to tell Wesley that there was trouble with a stretch of fence on the property line between the two ranches, that some of the Thatcher cattle had gotten through and were grazing on the Alvarez land, and that Eduardo was dealing with a sick horse and could use an extra hand. Wesley rode out within the hour, taking Felix with him, and he looked back once from the saddle and told Eudora he'd be back by nightfall. It was the first time she had been alone at the ranch. Hob was there, of course, puttering around the barn, but the house was empty in a way it had not been before, and she moved through the afternoon's work with an awareness of that emptiness that she found unexpectedly instructive. She missed him, not in a dramatic or devastating way, but in the simple, quiet manner of noticing that something usual was absent, the way you notice the absence of a familiar sound. She stood at the kitchen window in the afternoon light, peeling potatoes for supper, and registered this fact about herself with the same careful attention she gave to things she did not yet fully understand. Wesley returned at dusk, as promised, with Eduardo Alvarez riding alongside him to return the borrowed help. Eduardo was a compact, energetic man in his 40s who spoke with a mix of Spanish and English, and who shook Eudora's hand with the straightforward warmth of someone for whom hospitality was an automatic condition. He and his wife had been in this valley for 15 years, he told her, since before the worst of the land-grant trouble, and he knew this land the way you know the face of someone you have loved for a long time. He stayed for supper, and they sat around the big table and ate beans, and the last of the summer squash and cornbread that Eudora had made, and the conversation moved across a dozen subjects: the fence repairs, the cattle prices, a rumor about a new sheriff coming from Las Vegas, the weather turning, and Eudora watched Wesley in this social context and noticed things she had not seen before. He was at ease with Eduardo in a way that had no performance in it. He laughed at a story about a mule that had somehow ended up in Eduardo's kitchen, a real laugh that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and Eudora felt something shift in her chest that she recognized, eventually, as the beginning of longing. Eduardo left after supper with a lantern and his horse, and Wesley and Eudora cleared the table in the lamplight, moving around the kitchen in the easy coordination they had developed over the past weeks, and it was Wesley who said, quite quietly and without looking at her, "You made that supper feel like something more than supper." She paused with a stack of plates in her hands. "What does that mean?" He was at the dry sink and he turned to look at her. "This house has been quiet for a long time," he said, Since Margaret, I didn't mind the quiet mostly, but tonight it felt like, I don't know, a house that's being lived in. Eudora set the plates down carefully. I'm glad, she said. She meant it simply, and she said it simply, and the simplicity of it seemed to be the right thing, because Wesley nodded once and turned back to the sink. But there was a quality to the silence after that was different from the silences before. October arrived, and with it the beginning of the autumn cattle drive preparations. In 1884, the cattle operations in the Cimarron country were largely feeding into the eastern markets through the railways, and there was a period each autumn of sorting, accounting, and moving cattle to the shipping pens in Cimarron. Wesley worked long days during this period, coming in after dark with a tiredness that was thorough and honest, and Eudora had hot suppers waiting and sometimes coffee if he had been particularly late, and they sat together in the lamplight, and she listened to him talk about the work in the way that she had come to understand was not just conversation, but decompression, the talking out of a day's worth of decisions and problems. She began to understand cattle in ways she had not expected to. Not the physical management of them. She did not pretend to know that, but the economics, the rhythms, the particular anxieties that came with running a cattle operation in a country that was changing. The open range was not going to last. She knew this in an abstract way from the newspapers, and Wesley knew it more specifically and personally, and they talked about it in the evenings with the kind of candor that Eudora had rarely experienced in conversation with a man. Her aunt's world had operated on the assumption that women participated in conversations as agreeable background, and that the serious talk was for men. Wesley did not seem to know this rule or had decided it did not apply. He asked her once in early October what she had actually wanted her life to look like before circumstance had made the decisions for her. The question was asked directly and without any framing of sympathy, which was why she answered it honestly. I wanted to make things, she said. I'm a good seamstress. I wanted to have a shop, a small one, nothing grand. Just a place that was mine where people came because I was good at my work. She paused. My aunt thought this was an unmarried woman's fantasy. She thought the proper ambition was to be a good wife. Those don't have to be different things, Wesley said. Instant. Louis in 1884 they mostly are, she said. He considered this. Maybe things are different out here, he said, and she was not entirely sure what he meant, but she held the words carefully, like something fragile. There was an evening in the second week of October that she would remember afterward as the point at which everything shifted, though it did not feel dramatic at the time. It felt, if anything, entirely ordinary, which was its own kind of extraordinary. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which they sometimes did when the weather was still mild, in the wooden chairs that Hob had repaired earlier in the season, and the sky was doing its evening performance of colors, the mountains going from their daytime shades into something more elemental and dark, the first stars appearing in the east. Wesley had been quiet for a while, and then he said, I'm glad you came. Eudora looked at him. Even though I was sent here as someone's inconvenience. He turned his head to look at her then, and something in his expression was very direct, more direct than he usually allowed himself to be. I don't see it that way, he said. I see it as I wrote a letter asking for help and the right person showed up. The right person, she said softly. You've made this place into something I'd stopped believing it could be again, he said. Not just the cooking and the garden, though those things matter too. You've made it feel like it could have a future in it. He stopped. I don't know if I'm saying that right. You are, she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands in her lap were not quite. You're saying it very right. They were quiet for a while, and the stars continued their slow multiplication, and Eudora became aware of the distance between them, perhaps 18 inches of cool October air, as something that had suddenly become significant. Eudora, he said. Yes, she said. I'm going to say something, and I want you to tell me honestly if it's unwelcome. All right. I find myself thinking about you in ways that are, he stopped, tried again. I lost Margaret, and I thought that was the end of that part of my life. I wasn't looking for anything, But you came here and you've been so yourself, all the way through without pretending anything. And I find that Wesley, she said quietly. Yes, I think about you too. The silence that followed had a quality of fullness, of something that had been building for weeks finding finally its container. He reached across the space between them and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, and the warmth of it went through her like the first touch of sun on a cold morning. She turned her hand over and he held it properly, and they sat like that in the October dark, with the stars coming out overhead and the distant sound of the river in the cottonwoods, and it was the simplest thing and also the largest. He walked her to the door of the house that night as he always did, a formality they had kept throughout, which now felt charged with something different, and at the door he stopped and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had by now catalogued with great precision, and he said, "I don't want this to be complicated for you. You came here in difficult circumstances. I don't want you to feel, I feel," she said firmly, "exactly what I told you I feel. I am not a woman who says things to be polite." He almost smiled. "No," he said, "you're really not. Good night, Wesley. Good night, Eudora." She went inside and stood in the kitchen with both hands pressed to her face and allowed herself a full 30 seconds of undignified happiness before she got herself together and went to bed. The following weeks carried the quality of something new and extremely alive. There was no formal declaration between them. This was not that kind of situation, and they were not that kind of people, but the shift was evident in everything. The way he looked at her across the supper table, the way she began to learn the small grammar of his expressions, the particular set of his jaw when he was worried about something, the way his eyes softened when he was amused, the deliberate patience of his silences. The evening walks became something understood rather than improvised, and the conversations on them became less careful, more layered, more willing to touch the raw material of their respective lives. He told her about Margaret, really told her, not just the brief facts she had gathered in pieces, but the full story of their 6 years together, the early hardships and the good years, and the loss of a pregnancy in the 3rd year. And then the fever that had come in the spring 3 years ago and taken Margaret in 9 days, so fast that he had not been able to believe it was happening until it was done. He told her this one evening sitting on a flat rock above the river, and his voice was level throughout, but she could see in the precision of his stillness that this was not an easy telling. "I am not asking you to replace her," he said when he had finished. "I want to say that clearly because it would be an unfair thing to ask and you're too much yourself to be anyone's replacement anyway." "I know," she said. "I'm not afraid of her memory. She sounds like someone worth remembering." He looked at her steadily. "She was," he said, "and so are you." Eudora, who had spent a significant portion of her adult life in circumstances that communicated the opposite message, did not know what to do with this for a moment. She felt her throat tighten in a way she was not going to permit in public, and so she looked out at the river and took a breath of the cold, sage-smelling air. "You're very good at saying the right thing for a man who claims not to talk much," she managed. "I only talk when I have something to say," he said. "Then you always have something worth saying," she told him, and he took her hand in the evening light and they stayed by the river until the cold drove them back to the house. In early November, a situation arose that put the equilibrium of the ranch under a different kind of pressure. A man named Kurt Hadley, who ran a larger cattle operation about 20 miles north and who had been involved in the tail end of the land grant disputes, sent a rider to the Thatcher ranch with a message claiming that a section of the northern grazing range, 20-odd acres along a seasonal creek, belonged properly to the Hadley operation, and that he expected Wesley to cease grazing that section by the end of the month. Wesley read the message at the supper table while Eudora and Felix and Hob ate in a silence that had a waiting quality to it. She watched his face go still in the particular way that meant he was controlled and also deeply angry. "That section has been Thatcher Range since my father filed on it in 1859, he said, to no one specifically. "Is there documentation?" Eudora asked. He looked at her. There's a deed. It's in the strong box. Then that's where you start, she said. You start with the paperwork. You don't let a man make a claim with a note delivered by a rider and treat it as though it has any standing. You answer it formally in writing, and you cite the deed, and you send it to the county land office as well as to Hadley. Everyone at the table was looking at her. My uncle is in the dry goods business, she said, somewhat defensively. Land disputes and credit agreements were constantly under discussion. You handle them through proper channels or they drag on for years and somebody does something rash. Wesley looked at her for a long moment. Will you help me write the letter? Yes, she said. After supper. They sat at the kitchen table that evening with the deed spread between them, and Eudora drafted a letter that was precise and unambiguous, and that cited the relevant documentation and notified Hadley that any action contrary to the Thatcher deed would be referred to the county authority. Wesley read it through twice and then looked up at her. Where did you learn to write like this? I read everything I could get my hands on, she said, including every legal document that came through my uncle's house. It's remarkable what you absorb when people assume you're not paying attention. He shook his head slowly, not in negation but in something like wonder. You're remarkable, he said simply. She felt heat come to her face, which was something she had not experienced since she was 17 and had no use for. The letter needs to be copied twice, she said briskly. We should have ink enough. The Hadley matter was resolved, as such things often were when properly documented, without escalating to violence. Hadley sent a terse reply acknowledging the deed reference, and the county land office confirmed the Thatcher claim, and that was the end of it. Wesley was philosophical about it. Hobb was vocally delighted by the outcome and told Felix and anyone else who would listen that the new housekeeper had handled Kurt Hadley better than a lawyer from Santa Fe could have. Felix agreed enthusiastically. Eudora accepted these compliments with as much equanimity as she could manage, which was slightly less than she would have preferred. Thanksgiving came in November with cold and the first real snow dusting the mountains, and Eudora cooked a meal of such ambitious proportions. A turkey that Felix had shot on the range, roasted sweet potatoes, cornbread, a dried apple pie, that Hobbs said it was the best he'd eaten since before the war, which might have been an overstatement but was clearly meant with all sincerity. Eduardo and Consuelo Alvarez came over with their two sons, 16 and 18 years old and enormously enthusiastic about the food. And Consuelo, a warm and forthright woman with black hair going gray at the temples, looked from Wesley to Eudora across the table with the knowing expression of a person who sees exactly what is happening and finds it satisfying. She cornered Eudora in the kitchen afterward while the men sat in the main room and helped her wash the dishes, which she had not asked her to do and which Eudora accepted gratefully. You are good for him, Consuelo said, in her particular mix of languages that Eudora had by now learned to follow easily. He was alone too long. A man like Wesley who is made to have a home being alone like that is like, she searched for the word, like a fire that has no one tending it. It keeps itself going, but there is nothing joyful in it. Eudora dried a plate carefully. He's a good man, she said. He is, Consuelo agreed. And you are a good woman, I have eyes. Do not let the past and the difficult getting here make you afraid of the good thing that is right in front of you. Eudora looked at her. I'm not afraid, she said. She paused. Well, I am sometimes afraid. Consuelo patted her arm with a wet hand and left a damp mark on Eudora's sleeve and did not appear to notice or care. Being afraid and doing it anyway is the only kind of brave there is, she said. December in the territory was cold but not the killing cold of Missouri, and the snow when it came was clean and brilliant, the mountains going white and the mornings arriving with a clarity that was almost painful. The kitchen garden was dormant, properly mulched and put to bed for winter, and Eudora had taken on some indoor mending and stitching work. The ranch's supply of shirts and work clothes was in a state of historical disrepair, and she sat in the evenings by the fire with her needle and thread while Wesley read, which was another thing she had not expected of him and which delighted her, that he read widely and with real curiosity. History and natural science, and the occasional novel that arrived via the Cimarron General Store. One evening in mid-December, he put down a worn copy of a history of the territory, one of the books about the land and its long human occupation. The Comanche and the Apache and the Pueblones and the Spanish and the Americans all layered on top of each other with varying degrees of violence, and all that complexity still very much alive in the land around them, and said, "Have you thought about what you want to do? In the long term, I mean. You came here on a one-way ticket. Have you thought about what comes next?" Eudora kept her eyes on her stitching for a moment. "I think about it," she said carefully, "because I want you to know that you are not—" He stopped, tried again. This was, she had learned, how he approached things that mattered to him. He went slowly because he wanted to get it right. "You're not here on sufferance. You're not here as someone's problem to be managed. I want you to know that if you wanted to leave for any reason, I would do everything I could to help you do that. But if you wanted to stay, Wesley—" "I'm still talking," he said mildly. She smiled at her sewing. "Sorry. If you wanted to stay, it would not have to be as a housekeeper. I'm saying it badly. What I mean is that I have been trying for 2 months to find the right moment to tell you that I am in love with you. And apparently the right moment is in December by the fire while you're darning one of Hobbs' socks." She looked up from the sock. He was looking at her from across the fire with the expression of a man who has said the true thing and is now entirely in the hands of the outcome. And his eyes in the firelight were that gray that she had come to find the most honest color in the world. "I'm in love with you too," she said. "I've known it since about October." "October," he repeated. "The evening by the river," she said, "when you told me about Margaret." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are we going to do about that?" "I think," she said, setting down the sock, "that we should start with you coming over here and sitting beside me, because this conversation is making the fire seem very far away." He was across the room in a way that was neither slow nor hurried but simply purposeful, and he sat down beside her on the hearthside bench, and she turned to him, and he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for a long moment with an attention that was at once completely serious and very tender. "I'm going to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not yet. Not tonight. You should have time and I should do it properly. But I want you to know that's where this is going, so there's no confusion." "There is no confusion," she said. "There hasn't been for a while." And then he kissed her for the first time, and it was not a tentative thing but a thorough one, full of all the weeks of careful accumulation. And when they drew apart, Eudora sat in the firelight with her hand on his chest and felt something in her that had been held very tightly for a very long time go slowly, completely open. Christmas was the first holiday Eudora had spent in years that felt genuinely warm. Consuelo came over on Christmas morning with tamales, which was her family's tradition and which Eudora found extraordinary, and the two women worked together in the kitchen while the men dealt with the morning chores, and Wesley looked at Eudora whenever he came in from outside with a look that Hob caught and responded to by developing a sudden urgent need to be in the barn for most of the day. Felix, who was 20 and perceptive, watched all of this with the satisfaction of someone who has been hoping for a particular outcome and is now witnessing it, and he said nothing, which was itself a kind of eloquence. There were small gifts exchanged: a pocket knife for Felix from Wesley, wool stockings for Hob from Eudora, who had knitted them herself, a book about horses sent from a catalog for Eduardo, who was trying to improve his breeding stock. Wesley gave Eudora a length of fine wool fabric in a dark blue that matched exactly the color she had mentioned admiring on a woman in Cimarron 2 months ago, which she had not thought he'd noticed, and she stood in the main room holding the folded fabric and looked at him and could not speak for a moment. "I thought," he said, somewhat uncertainly, "for a dress or a coat, or you're the one who knows what to do with cloth, I just—" "It's perfect," she said. "It's absolutely perfect. How did you remember that?" "I remember everything you say," he told her simply. She had gotten him a copy of a new book on cattle management that had been reviewed in one of the newspapers, and a small compass in a brass case, which she told him was for the times he rode out alone in the dark to check on the herd, and he held the compass in his palm and looked at it as though it were considerably more than a compass. "So I always know my way back," he said. "So you always know your way back," she confirmed. January brought deep cold and long, lamplit evenings, and January was when things happened with a speed that surprised both of them, in the way that things which have been building for months tend to move quickly when they finally begin. Wesley asked her to marry him on a Sunday evening in the second week of January properly, with the kind of directness that was entirely him and not a borrowed gesture. He was not a man who would drop to his knee in a theatrical way, and she did not want him to be. He stood in the kitchen while she was making coffee and said, "Eudora, I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife, and I want to spend every year I have left on this ranch with you in it. Will you marry me?" She turned from the stove with both coffee cups in her hands and looked at him across the kitchen and said, "Yes, of course, yes. Wesley, you ridiculous man, yes." He laughed that full, real laugh that she loved and crossed the kitchen and took the coffee cups out of her hands and set them on the table and kissed her properly, and they stayed in the warm kitchen for a considerable time after that. They were married in Cimarron in February 1885, at the small Catholic church where, as it happened, more of the territory's weddings took place than in any other building in town, and the ceremony was conducted by Father Morales, a patient man who had been in Cimarron long enough to have given last rites to several notable outlaws, and had therefore developed a comprehensive perspective on human nature. Eduardo and Consuelo stood up with them as witnesses, and Hob and Felix sat in the front pew looking deeply pleased with themselves, as though they had arranged the whole thing. Eudora wore the dark blue wool, made up in the previous weeks into a walking dress that was the finest thing she had sewn since leaving St. Louis, and she wore her hair down on one side the way she liked it, and carried a bunch of dried winter wildflowers that Consuelo had gathered from her own dried arrangements and pressed into her hands that morning. Wesley wore his best shirt, which she had mended and laundered herself, and his good hat, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle of that small church. It was not a long walk, it was not a grand aisle, but it was entirely real, with an expression that made Father Morales smile and Consuelo reach for Eduardo's hand. The vows were said and meant, with a simple directness that suited both of them. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon under a sky that was very blue and very cold and entirely indifferent to human events, as the sky in the territory always was, and when the ranch came into view in the gathering dusk, the low adobe house with the lamp already lit in the window, because Felix had gone ahead to do exactly that, Eudora felt a recognition that went deeper than familiarity. "Home," she said. Wesley, beside her on the wagon bench, looked at her and then at the house. "Home," he agreed. Spring came early that year, and with it the full return of the kitchen garden, which Eudora expanded considerably, adding a row of pepper plants and a herb bed along the south-facing wall of the house where the heat collected. She had also begun, in the long winter evenings, to do sewing work for women in Cimarron, nothing formal yet, but word had traveled through Consuelo and through the women at the church, and there was a steady trickle of commissions arriving. A wedding dress for a girl named Anna Reyes, whose mother had come to the ranch in some distress, and been received by Eudora with tea and a measuring tape and reassurance. A coat for the wife of one of the county land office men. Several shirts for Eduardo's sons, who were now of an age to want shirts that fit properly. Wesley watched this develop with something that was visibly, quietly proud. He cleared a corner of the bedroom for a proper work table, and when the old treadle sewing machine at the Cimarron General Store came up for sale in April, left behind by a family moving further west, he bought it without mentioning it to her and had Felix drive the wagon to fetch it, and when it appeared in her work corner she stood looking at it for a full silent moment. "Wesley Thatcher," she said. "You needed one," he said. "You bought me a sewing machine." "It was available," he said, and the deliberate understatement was entirely in his voice, but his eyes were bright. She kissed him in the middle of the kitchen in front of Felix, who pretended to be very busy with something on the other side of the room, and Wesley accepted this with tremendous dignity. Summer came back, and with it, the full, blazing heat and the afternoon thunderstorms and the grass going green along the river, while the upland range went its familiar summer brown. The cattle were thriving. It was a good year, with fair prices, and Wesley had begun to talk about adding to the herd in a cautious, deliberate way, investing in quality rather than volume, because he had been reading about the changes coming, and he was not a man who ignored information that contradicted what he wanted to believe. He brought a small herd of better-bred cattle up from Santa Fe in the summer of 1885, and the ranch moved into its next iteration of itself. In July of that year, Eudora told Wesley she was expecting a child. She told him in the early morning, before he went out to the range, standing in the kitchen with the dawn light coming through the east window and the coffee just coming to a boil. He went still in the way he went still when something large was happening, and then he sat down very deliberately in one of the kitchen chairs and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something overwhelmed and very tender and afraid in the way that people are afraid about things they care about enormously. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings. Consuelo says that's normal." "You've told Consuelo." "I needed to ask someone who'd been through it," she said. "You weren't available and she was. She's very pleased, incidentally." She cried. He stood up from the chair and came to her and held her carefully as though she were something fragile, and she pressed her face against his shirt and felt his heart going at a speed that told her he was more affected than his careful face let on. "This ranch needed this," he said quietly into her hair. "The ranch," she said, pulling back to look at him. "I mean I needed it," he corrected, and his eyes were very bright. "We needed it. This place needed another generation in it." She put her hand on his face and said, "We're going to be all right, you know." "I know," he said. He covered her hand with his. "With you here I have known that for a while." The autumn passed in the particular richness of expectancy, not just the child, though that gave the season a quality of anticipation that colored everything, but the work of the ranch, the kitchen garden brought in, the root cellar filled, the sewing commissions that had by now become a real and acknowledged enterprise. Eudora had begun to keep accounts, a small ledger where she recorded the commissions and the materials and the income, and what she was building in that ledger was a thing she recognized as the beginning, improbable as it had seemed in St. Louis, of the small business she had once wanted. She wrote a letter to her Aunt Clara in the early autumn. She had written before brief, factual letters that acknowledged her situation without giving anything real away, but this one was different. She wrote it at the kitchen table in the late afternoon, with the ranch quiet around her and the mountains visible through the west window, and she told Clara that she was married to a good man, and that she was expecting a child in the winter, and that she was well. She said, without malice and without excess, that she understood Clara had meant to do what was best given the circumstances, and that she bore her no ill will. She did not thank her for sending her here exactly, because that would have been disingenuous. The sending had been done for Clara's convenience and not for Eudora's benefit, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she said that it had worked out, and that the territory had turned out to be something other than what either of them had imagined. She sealed the letter and gave it to Felix to post in Cimarron, and then she went back to the treadle machine and worked on a small garment in white cotton, very carefully, with a precision born of both skill and love. Clara wrote back in November, a shorter letter than Eudora had expected and warmer than she had anticipated, expressing genuine pleasure, and saying that Gerald Hollies had eventually married a woman from Chicago who apparently suited him very well, which Eudora received as information rather than absolution, but which she noted gave her a certain clean-feeling closure. Clara asked about the territory and asked about Wesley, and asked whether Eudora was truly happy, and Eudora wrote back simply, She was. Their son was born in December 1885, a few days before Christmas, with Consuelo attending and a doctor from Cimarron who arrived 3 hours late because of the road conditions and was therefore somewhat superfluous. The labor was long and hard, and Eudora got through it with the same quality of fierce, focused determination that she brought to everything else, and Wesley sat outside the bedroom door for 6 hours in a state of barely contained anxiety that Hob told Felix made him look 10 years older in the space of an afternoon. When Consuelo opened the bedroom door and said, "A boy, Wesley, healthy and loud," he was through the door before she finished the sentence. The baby was indeed loud and was also, Wesley thought, impossibly small, and he held him with the great carefulness of a large man holding something he absolutely cannot afford to drop, and Eudora watched from the bed, tired in a way that went to her bones but lit from somewhere deep inside with a happiness that had a quality unlike anything she had previously experienced, larger than herself, more permanent than anything she had made with her hands. "What do we name him?" Wesley asked, looking at the baby with an expression that was completely undone, all his usual careful reserve gone, just a man holding his son and not pretending to be anything other than exactly what he was. "Thomas," Eudora said. She had thought about it. "For your father, and Elias for mine." Wesley looked at her over the baby's head. "Thomas Elias Thatcher," he said, testing it. "Yes," she said. "That's a good name," he said. "I thought so," she said. Thomas Elias Thatcher, having been named, expressed an opinion on the matter at considerable volume, and Consuelo laughed from the doorway, and outside Hob could be heard telling Felix something that involved profuse relief. The years that followed moved in the way that genuinely happy years tend to move, with a speed that is not caused by emptiness but by fullness, each day too occupied and too alive to seem long. Thomas grew from a loud, healthy infant into a small person with his father's gray eyes and his mother's sharpness of mind, and the ranch grew around him, more cattle added carefully each year. The house extended to accommodate the new rooms that became necessary. The kitchen garden doubled, and then doubled again, until it had become a genuine growing operation that supplied not just the ranch but a few families in Cimarron as well. Eudora's sewing enterprise became, by 1887, an actual shop, a small room rented above the general store in Cimarron, where she worked 2 days a week while Consuelo or the new hired girl watched Thomas. The shop was her own, registered in her name with the county, her name lettered on the door glass in the careful hand of the sign painter who came through Cimarron twice a year. She had clients not just from Cimarron but from ranches and settlements across the county, and she employed on an occasional basis 2 women from town whose needlework was good, and the ledger she kept was no longer a tentative thing but a real account of a real business. Wesley rode into Cimarron to meet her one afternoon in the spring of 1887 and walked up the outside stairs to the shop room and stood in the doorway looking at her sitting at the treadle machine in the afternoon light, with fabric everywhere and the sound of the needle moving through cloth. And she looked up and saw him and smiled the smile that was for him specifically, the one without guard in it. And he thought, as he had been thinking at various intervals since December 1884, when she'd pulled weeds out of the bean row in the early morning, that whoever had put her on that train to send her west had given him the greatest gift of his life, and that they had done it for the wrong reasons. Entirely, which was perhaps the greatest joke the territory had ever told. He came in and sat on the chair in the corner that she kept for clients, and they talked while she worked, the familiar, easy conversation that was the private language of their life together, and it was like every other afternoon they had ever spent talking, and also completely irreplaceable. In the summer of 1888 their second child arrived, a daughter, born in the early morning of a July day when the thunderheads were building over the mountains and the air smelled of rain and sage. She was smaller than Thomas had been and quieter, which Consuelo said was the joke the universe made on busy households, and she had Eudora's dark eyes and a composure in early infancy that seemed inexplicable and slightly impressive. They named her Clara Margaret Clara for Eudora's aunt, a gesture that was complicated and deliberate, and that acknowledged the ways in which the past had led here, and Margaret for the woman who had loved this ranch and this man before Eudora had, and whose garden she had rescued, and whose memory she had long ago stopped being afraid of and started simply honoring. It was a naming that held a lot of history in it, and that felt right for a child born on this land where history was layered deep. Wesley held Clara Margaret the way he had held Thomas, with that same careful, enormous tenderness, and then he looked at Eudora and she saw in his face the same thing she felt herself, the staggering, undeniable, deeply ordinary miracle of this life they had built. "I'm fairly certain," he said, "that I am the luckiest man in the New Mexico territory." "You have excellent judgment," she said, and closed her eyes against the pillow while the rain came down outside and the baby in his arms was quiet. Thomas was 2.5 by this point and had strong opinions about the new baby, which shifted from suspicion to a bossy protectiveness over the course of several weeks, and which Wesley and Eudora watched with the enjoyment of people observing something that is both amusing and deeply right. Felix, who by 1888 was 23 and had been on the Thatcher Ranch for most of his adult working life, eventually left in the autumn of that year for reasons that were actually very good ones. He had fallen in love with a young woman named Rosa from Cimarron, and her family owned a small farm, and the opportunity arose to take on a share of it. He came to tell Wesley and Eudora on a Sunday, with his hat in his hand and a mixture of guilt and joy on his face, and Wesley shook his hand and Eudora hugged him and told him he had been family here and would remain so, which was true, because they saw him regularly in Cimarron for years after. Hob stayed. Hob, who was by this point well into his 60s and slowing down, became more of a fixture than a ranch hand. He knew the Thatcher land better than anyone alive, and he had a gift with horses that did not diminish with age, and he sat on the porch in the evenings and talked to whoever would listen, and was apparently content. He died in the winter of 1890, peacefully, in his bed in the bunkhouse, and Wesley and Eudora buried him on the ranch in a spot he had chosen himself, under a juniper tree that overlooked the valley. There was a proper service, with Father Morales coming out from Cimarron, and Eduardo and Consuelo and half a dozen men from neighboring ranches came, and Hob was sent off with the respect of a man whose life had been spent honestly. The ranch hired new hands over the years, a young man from Texas named Cal, and later his cousin, and a quiet Navajo man named Samuel who had a way with the cattle that was almost wordless and entirely effective. The ranch became more prosperous each year, not dramatically, not in the boom and collapse way that had ruined many larger operations in the territory in the late 1880s. Eudora's careful reading and the conversations she and Wesley had in the lamplight had resulted in a conservatism that protected them when the cattle market fell in 1886 and again in 1889. They were not wealthy by Eastern standards, but they were solid and they were free, and every inch of the land they stood on belonged to them. Eudora's shop in Cimarron continued to grow. By 1890, she employed 3 women regularly and had built a reputation that reached as far as Las Vegas, New Mexico, where a letter had arrived asking if she could create a wedding dress for a prominent family's daughter. She had gone to Las Vegas for 2 weeks with a trunk of samples and come back with a commission that paid more than the ranch's cattle sales that quarter. Wesley had been absurdly proud of this, and she had tried to be modest about it and failed completely. "You're allowed to be pleased," he said. "You built something from nothing out here when nobody handed you anything." "I was handed a sewing machine," she said. "I maintain that was a sound investment," he said. She laughed, and he caught her around the waist where she was trying to walk past him to the kitchen, and she turned in his arms and looked at him. This man who was somehow more familiar to her with each passing year and also, somehow, always slightly new, and felt with the full force of the life she had made the tremendous, grounding weight of genuine happiness. By 1891, the Thatcher house had been expanded twice. A proper bedroom addition for Thomas, now 5 and increasingly convinced that he was in charge of the ranch, and a large, sunny room on the east side that served as Eudora's working room when she was at home, with proper shelving for her fabric and her thread, and a good lamp hung from the ceiling. The kitchen garden had evolved into a larger plot that Thomas helped with in the haphazard but enthusiastic way of 5-year-olds, and Clara Margaret, 3 years old, followed her brother around with a seriousness that suggested she was compiling detailed notes. They celebrated their 6th wedding anniversary in February 1891 with a dinner that Consuelo and Eduardo came to, and the table was full, and the room was warm, and outside it was snowing lightly. And after dinner, Wesley sat by the fire with Clara Margaret asleep against his chest, and Thomas asleep on the rug at his feet, because Thomas refused to go to bed while there were guests, and had lost the argument against sleep sometime around 8 o'clock. And Eudora sat across from him in the lamplight, and thought about the woman who had stood on the railway platform in St. Louis in August 1884, with a one-way ticket and nothing left to lose. She had thought then that being sent away was an ending. She had been wrong in every possible direction. Eduardo caught her expression from his place at the table and said quietly, "You look like a woman who is thinking something good." "I am," she said. "Good," he said. "You have earned it." Consuelo, from the other side of the table, raised her coffee cup in a small, private toast. Eudora raised hers back. Wesley, across the fire, was watching her with those gray eyes that she had never once in 6 years stopped finding the most honest thing in any room, and he said nothing, because he didn't need to. She said to him just quietly enough that it was for him, "I think about that train sometimes." "The train to Cimarron, yes. I think about the letter I wrote," he said. "I almost didn't send it. Hob told me I needed help and I kept arguing with myself about it." "What made you send it?" "Hob gave me the paper and the pen and sat there until I wrote it," he said. She laughed softly, not to wake the children. "Then we owe Hob a great deal." "I always thought so," said Wesley. He looked at Clara Margaret on his chest and then at Thomas on the rug and then back at her. "Eudora, yes, I want you to know something. Tell me. You were not sent here as a problem," he said. "I know that's how it was framed. I know that's the story of how you got here. But from where I was standing, from the moment I saw you on that platform in Cimarron with your carpet bag and your expression that said you would handle whatever came next, you were the answer to a question I'd been asking without knowing I was asking it." The fire crackled. The snow fell outside. The children slept their entirely reliable sleep, and Eduardo and Consuelo were talking quietly on the other side of the room, politely occupying themselves. And Eudora Thatcher, who had been Eudora Brenner, who had been sent west as someone else's inconvenience, set down her coffee cup and looked at her husband and felt the full depth of this life. The garden and the sewing and the children and the land and this man. This careful, honest, gray-eyed man who had said, "I remember everything you say," and meant it absolutely, and said, "And you were mine." They sat together by the fire while the territory snow fell outside, and the mountain stood in the dark exactly as they always had, enormous and indifferent to human concerns, and somehow also, in some way she had come to understand, entirely on their side. The lamp burned low and no one moved to refill it, and the room went to a warmer, softer light, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The years that came after were built on that foundation with the same care that the Thatcher Ranch had been built on its own, stone by stone, season by season, with the patience of people who understood that good things were not constructed quickly, but were maintained daily and would last. Thomas grew from a determined 5-year-old into a boy who knew the land the way his grandfather had, and who helped his father with the cattle with a seriousness that mixed with a humor he had inherited from his mother. Clara Margaret grew into herself quietly and with considerable authority, which surprised no one who had watched her as a toddler compiling notes on her brother. The shop in Cimarron became, by the mid-1890s, a genuine institution, the kind of business that people referred to by the name of its owner rather than its occupation. You went to Eudora's, not the seamstress's. And she took a deep satisfaction in this that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with having made the thing she had once only been able to imagine. Her Aunt Clara's letters, which came twice a year and which Eudora answered faithfully, were by 1893 warm in a way that had taken many years of slow rebuilding. And when Clara wrote to say that she was coming west to visit, just to see, she said, what the territory was like, what Eudora's life actually looked like, Eudora wrote back and told her to come. Clara Brenner arrived in Cimarron in the spring of 1894, a decade after she had put Eudora on the train, and she was smaller than Eudora remembered and older, with a softness in her eyes that had not been there before. She stood in the main room of the Thatcher house and looked around at the good, solid, inhabited space, the books on the shelves, the children's things in orderly corners, the kitchen visible through the doorway with its jars of preserves on the shelves, and then she looked at Eudora, and there was a long moment in which a great deal passed between them without words. "I thought I was sending you somewhere difficult," Clara said. "You were," Eudora said, "and then it turned out to be somewhere extraordinary." "I'm glad," Clara said, and her voice was genuine. "I was not in those days as good as I should have been to you, I know that." "You did what you thought was right with the information you had," Eudora said. This was not absolution, and Clara seemed to understand that, but it was also not condemnation, and it was the truest thing she could say. Thomas and Clara Margaret received their great-aunt with their customary combination of curiosity and reserve, and Wesley received her with the easy, unpretentious hospitality that was his nature, and by the end of her 2-week visit, she stayed in the room that Eudora had made up in the expansion. Clara had confessed over supper one evening that she had never imagined the territory could look like this, which Eudora took to mean that she had expected something grim and had found something beautiful, which was exactly what Eudora herself had found 10 years ago in a different and far more personal way. Clara went back to St. Louis with 3 jars of tomatoes from the kitchen garden and a shawl that Eudora had made her, in a soft gray wool that suited her perfectly because Eudora knew, professionally and personally, how to look at a person and see what they needed. She wrote when she arrived home that the visit had been the best thing she had done in years, and Eudora believed her. The children grew, and the ranch prospered, and the seasons turned with the regularity of things that are properly established. And Eudora and Wesley lived their life in the way that people live when they have built something real, not without difficulty, because no life is, but with the capacity to handle difficulty that comes from knowing who you are and where you stand and who stands beside you. On an evening in the autumn of 1895, when Thomas was 9 and Clara Margaret was 7, and the cottonwoods along the river were doing their annual transformation into gold, Wesley and Eudora were sitting on the porch as they still did when the weather permitted, with the sunset doing its vast, improbable work on the mountains to the west, and Thomas was somewhere in the corrals with Cal the ranch hand, learning something about horses. And Clara Margaret was on the step below them with a length of fabric that she had commandeered from Eudora's workroom, and was attempting to sew with a focus that was both deeply familiar and slightly alarming. "Look at her," Wesley said quietly. "I know," Eudora said. "She's going to be everything," Eudora said. "She's going to be exactly everything she wants to be." They sat in the amber autumn light, the two of them, on the porch of the house that had become home in the truest sense of that word, and the mountains were doing what the mountains in the territory always do, standing enormous and unimpressed by everything, witnessing everything, and somehow making the human things happening at their feet feel both very small and very permanent at once. Wesley reached over and took her hand, as he had on an October evening 11 years ago, the first time when everything had begun to shift, and she turned her hand and held his as she had then, and the warmth of it was the same, that same quality of rightness, of fitting, of a thing that had always been what it was supposed to be. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me." "I think about how Clara used to call me a problem," she said. "How everyone who sent me here thought they were getting rid of something inconvenient. And," he said. She looked at the mountains, at the gold light, at her daughter on the step below them carefully attempting a seam, at the life arranged in all directions around her, solid, real hers. "And I think," she said, "that I got the better end of that deal by a very long way." Wesley squeezed her hand and looked out at the mountains and said, "So did I, Eudora." "So did I." The evening settled around them, and the stars began their patient appearance in the east, and the territory did what the territory had always done. It went on, vast and old and entirely itself, while the people it had gathered to it made their lives in its shadow and found, sometimes, more than they had ever dared to hope for. The kitchen window was lit from within. The horses in the corrals were quiet. Thomas came running from the barn with something he wanted to show his father, and Wesley rose from the chair without letting go of Eudora's hand until he had to, and Clara Margaret looked up from her sewing to watch, and the lamp in the house window burned against the coming dark, and everything was exactly where it belonged.